laureates, and now a crucial backing from the Biden administration to waive intellectual property protections. Critics, including drug companies, say this plan won't help and could even slow the global rollout. So, what's the fastest way to vaccinate the world? Here's what you need to know.
Developing countries are asking for a waiver on intellectual property rights in the vaccines so that they can either develop their own vaccines or have access to cheaper options. However, unfortunately, right now, the EU and its member states, as well as other rich countries, are blocking this waiver.
Backed by about 100 countries, this would entail waiving a key global trade agreement known as TRIPS. They argue that the time-limited waiver would promote more manufacturing and a much faster rollout of jabs.
Pharma companies are putting profit, not people, first. We need companies to share all their research.
On the other side, however, opponents say it won't necessarily help. One argument is that waiving patents wouldn't make much of a difference in the first place. They say this is because the capacity to safely manufacture vaccines elsewhere is far too limited. The main long-standing objection, though, is that suspending IP rights would remove the incentive for drug companies to innovate in the future. In other words, without IP rules, drug companies wouldn't have good reasons to risk billions on research and development. We would also probably never have gotten COVID-19 vaccines so quickly.
Typically in vaccine development, it takes years because you're waiting for fairly rare events to occur, which is infections of the disease you're trying to prevent.
We have experience in the messenger RNA field for more than a decade, and we have technologies in place which allows us to make vaccines and evaluate vaccine candidates in an ultra-fast fashion.
Critics, however, question one or both of these arguments. Campaigners and prominent economists, including Mariana Mazzucato, say that firstly, intellectual property rights were never designed for use during deadly pandemics, and exceptions have been created in past, like penicillin during the Second World War. Secondly, it's not just IP protections that may drive incentives to innovate and produce, but government funding. In the US, 6 vaccine companies have received about $12 billion of public money and a lot more historically for basic research.
This idea that somehow a time-limited patent waiver to deal with extraordinary circumstances would somehow stifle future innovation is very difficult to buy, because there are some very deep fault lines in the way we currently fund our innovation systems. The reason why this makes sense is the biggest driver of innovation really is need and necessity. By imposing these patents, we take away this key motivating factor from poorer countries. The countries are poor. They're not incompetent when it comes to technical innovation. So we take away that blockage and we allow 1,000 flowers to bloom.
Thirdly, they argue that manufacturing capacity worldwide does exist and could potentially add hundreds of millions of doses to supply. But waiving IP rules wouldn't make a difference on its own. Without the technology and knowledge, a waiver may be a non-starter.
We must have a framework for the next pandemic.
World Trade Organization chief Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala says there is a so-called third way. She says companies should pursue more licensing agreements to get manufacturers on board. She also says companies should use multilateral arrangements to share technology and know-how voluntarily. But so far, the latter hasn't really been taken up.
Ideally, we would like pharmaceutical companies to be involved in that process, right? Because for the licensing to take place or to be part of the waiver would also involve not just information that might be in the patent application, but also technical know-how. Many of this information that's necessary might be commercially sensitive, might be held as trade secrets, might not be disclosed. So ideally, if we want this to be done with a sense of urgency, we need these companies to cooperate. If they're not going to cooperate, then I suggest governments support this waiver and allow developing countries to do their thing.
Drug companies, on the other hand, maintain they are up to the task of meeting the world's vaccine needs, and that it's other problems that have slowed things down. They say the unprecedented nature and scale of the pandemic has created shortages of everything from key ingredients to tubes and plastics. Trade barriers and restrictions, they say, are also slowing down supply chains. Nevertheless, as capacity is ramped up, they say worldwide production could reach 10 billion doses by the end of this year.
We are ready to discuss how the US proposal for waiver on intellectual property protection for COVID vaccines could help achieve that objective. In the short run, however, we call upon all vaccine-producing countries to allow exports and to avoid measures that disrupt supply chains.
It's a tall task that the WTO faces. Quick Takes Mark Daniel Davies. Thank you so much for that report. Maddie?
Let's get you some other coronavirus news from around the world. The COVID pandemic in India showing no signs of slowing down. The country reported its highest ever daily tally of more than 412,000 new cases and a record one-day death toll of nearly 4,000. India's government agreed to provide more medical oxygen to hospitals in the capital and denies being slow in getting out life-saving supplies donated from abroad. And Olympic athletes and delegations will be able to receive COVID vaccine doses donated by Pfizer and BioNTech as organizers push ahead with preparations for the delayed Games in Tokyo this summer. The International Olympic Committee signed an agreement with the companies to donate the doses, with the first delivery expected to begin at the end of this month. Now, the IOC has not made vaccination a requirement for athletes participating in the Games or for other workers who are going to be on site as well. And Russian authorities have given approval to a single-dose version of the country's Sputnik V vaccine after it showed almost 80% efficacy. Russia says the new vaccine, called Sputnik Light, costs under $10 a dose and has been earmarked for export and could increase the number of people with partial immunity. I can't imagine a vaccine called Vaccine Light working well in the U.S. Now, for the latest COVID news, bookmark Bloomberg.com/coronavirus. Scarlett.
It's all about branding, right? Right. Coming up after the break, don't call it a comeback, except that it kind of sort of is. It turns out older American millennials, those born in the 1980s, came out of the Trump era in better financial shape. We've got the surprising numbers next.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Our generation's biggest problem.
Climate change is happening.
And the world's most innovative solutions.
Transport, industry, buildings, electricity, all of those things.
Everything you need to know about our changing environment, the politics of global warming.
We can and we will deal with climate change.
In the fight against climate change, Bloomberg Green has you covered. Millennials made a lot of financial gains in the Trump era, but they're still way behind where their parents were at the same age. New data from the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank show 30-something Americans saw their wealth gap with prior generations improve from 2016 to 2019. But as with so many things these days, the recovery has been uneven. So let's bring in Anna Hernandez-Kent. She's a senior researcher at the St. Louis Fed's Institute for Economic Equity. Anna, welcome to Quick Take.
So you combed through a lot of data on consumer finances, and you found that the typical millennial family has seen improvement over the past 3 years, at least before COVID. I was really surprised by this. Get us started by telling us the key numbers and what they show about generational wealth.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Scarlett. And just before I begin, I want to say these are my own views and not necessarily those of the Fed. But essentially what we found is that the typical millennial family was about 40% behind in terms of wealth back in 2016. But just 3 years later, they had made significant gains and were only 11% behind after having nearly doubled their wealth.
So this is surprising. What do we know about why this happened, this improvement?
Contrary to perhaps popular belief and popular narrative, millennials are right on track with older generations in terms of home ownership and in terms of stock ownership. Over half of them have these assets, which have done pretty well in the past few years. And for millennials in particular, it seems like their home values have increased quite a bit, which is a large part of the story.
Okay, got it. There are also a lot of surveys that show millennials feel a lot more comfortable talking about how much money they make and how much they spend, certainly more so than Gen Xers or boomers. They often share numbers and tactics with each other, often to redress gender and racial pay gaps. Do we know how these older millennials closed the wealth gap from 40% to 11% in those 3 years?
So as I was saying, I would say home ownership is a big part of the story. Over 50% of older millennials are homeowners, and their home equity values have actually increased by about $20,000 between 2016 and 2019. So that's a large part of the story, as well as the fact that they are very highly educated. And so perhaps that education is finally paying off for some of them.
Okay, does it have anything, does income play a role here?
So what we've seen is that income, at least for graduates, those with college degrees, seems to be holding pretty steady, that college income premium, but it doesn't seem to be translating into wealth gains in the same way. So as I said, they are still somewhat behind, even if not quite as much as they were before.
Okay. That's the big picture, though. But as we know, the pandemic has created this K-shaped recovery where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And when you pull apart the data and you disaggregate it and you look at it by race, for instance, Black Americans are still pretty far behind. What kind of story does the data on Black Americans tell?
Absolutely. So my colleague and I, Lowell Ricketts, that was by far our most concerning finding, which was that Black older millennials had about $5,000 in wealth, or about half as much as we'd expect them to have, based on older generations of Black Americans. And not only that, but they were falling further and further behind each year. White millennials, on the other hand, had about $88,000 in wealth, which means that the racial wealth gap in this generation is astronomically large.
So it's interesting here because you're comparing older Black millennials with previous generations of Black Americans as opposed to looking across race. So you're really comparing like with like. You mentioned education earlier. That's a huge part of the story because millennials went to college at a time when student loans proliferated. Everyone was in debt. And of course, college tuition skyrocketed as well. What does the data on student loan debt tell us about the specific burdens that Black millennials faced?
So Black millennial graduates, those with a four-year degree or more, are much more likely than their white counterparts to have student loan debt. In fact, the majority of them, about 4 out of 5, do. And for those who didn't finish college, but maybe started it and took out debt, about a third of them have that debt and don't have the credentials to help them potentially pay that debt off.
Yeah, that's really,
so it's really concerning.
Yeah, absolutely. So these are the older millennials, and we're talking about people who were born in the 1980s. Does the data on younger millennials, perhaps those that were born in the 90s, tell a different story, or is it pretty much in line?
So far, we've only been able to look at the most recent survey wave for those 1990s millennials, myself included, and that's why I'm very eager to look at that decade. But so far, it is fairly concerning. And as of the most recent 2019 data, we're actually 50% behind wealth expectations. But on average, we're still very, very young, and it's early in our career, so we have a lot of time to catch up. Certainly more so than the older millennials do.
Interesting. How much debt do older millennials have overall? I mean, we talk about student loan debt. Of course, as they get older and they start buying houses and they start living their lives, the credit card debt, the auto loan debt, mortgages may start to replace some of the student loan debt. Can you give us a breakdown of the kind of debt that they have?
So just like older generations, the bulk of millennials' debt is in home mortgages. So roughly 60% or so of their debt is home mortgage debt. And this can be potentially, if it's at the right time and the right assets back it up, it can be a good kind of debt, right? It's going towards an asset that is appreciating, certainly in the last few months or so. On the other hand, the other types of debt that you talked about, vehicle debt, credit card debt certainly also make up quite a bit of the remaining portion of debt. And that's not necessarily going to be a quote unquote good type of debt for these millennial families.
Got it. Anna Hernandez-Kent of the St. Louis Fed, really appreciate your joining us and telling us about this. And hopefully this is data that will inform policymakers and decision makers as well. Maddie, millennials and wealth, we talk about that. Something else kind of comes to mind as well.
Right. It's a story that's not going anywhere, which is why starting today, we're giving you a daily cryptocurrency check, an update on the digital currency space. And we're starting, of course, with Dogecoin. The meme coin is down today while Bitcoin and Ethereum are climbing. Now, it's a win for the Doge haters who say it's nothing but a joke. But Doge loyalists who created this image of Elon Musk you can see behind me have a goal of getting the coin's value up to $1 by the time Musk hosts SNL this Saturday. He's a big Doge fan, so people are hopeful that he's going to mention the coin and drive up its value. Today's dip puts it at roughly 60 cents per coin.
And there's no dog in there, right? There's no
dog.
Ibu.
No dog, but they've got a lot of other Doge imagery hidden in there.
Like Elon's face.
Exactly. And we're going to get you some other tech news from today. Say goodbye to that photo crop on Twitter. Users rejoiced after the social media platform announced a new feature that allows photos to be displayed in full on the timeline. Now, before they were cropped, and that often led to some awkward photo upload moments. The new feature arrives as Twitter is also making users aware of potentially harmful language. The site rolled out a prompt for English language users, forcing them to pause and reconsider using hurtful or offensive words in their tweets. And Google is making a major push for security on World Password Day. In a blog post, the company says two-step verification will automatically be added to all user accounts. Now, with two-step verification, you typically have to confirm from your mobile phone that you are, in fact, the one that's trying to sign into your Google account. According to Google, searches for "how strong is my password" shot up 300% last year. And that's, of course, as privacy concerns went up while everyone was online during COVID. And Facebook says it's keeping up its crackdown on fake accounts. The company pulled 9 networks from its various services last month from 6 countries, including Mexico, Peru, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Palestine, and the Central African Republic. The report is part of an ongoing effort against coordinated misinformation from non-government entities. For the latest tech news, bookmark Bloomberg.com/technology. Scarlett?
Coming up after the break, Florida joins Texas and Georgia as the latest state to restrict voting. So how will this affect the swing state in upcoming elections? This is Quick Take.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Florida is now the latest state to codify voting rights restrictions into law. Republican Governor Ron DeSantis signed into law a voting bill which will limit access to mail-in voting and put stricter voter ID requirements in place, among other things. Republicans say this is all in response to 2020 election fraud, though there are no serious signs of voting irregularities. For more, let's bring in Bloomberg Government's Jennifer Kay. Jennifer, thank you for being here. I want to start with the mail-in voting restrictions. I know this is a big deal for Florida because there are so many snowbirds who aren't there in November, so they typically vote by mail. Can you describe how that particular restriction is going to have an impact on voter turnout in the state?
Well, voters who want to vote by mail are going to find themselves having to jump through more hoops to get those ballots and then return those ballots in the next election. And that's kind of a gamble for politicians here because, like you said, voting by mail is really popular. Historically, it was Republicans who were voting by mail the most in Florida, but we saw that flip last year with more Democrats voting by mail in November by a lot, by like 680,000 votes. So it'll be interesting to see if voters find themselves changing their voting habits or just getting frustrated by the limits in the new law in 2022. That's a really important election for Florida Republicans because both Governor DeSantis and Senator Marco Rubio will be up for reelection.
I want to put a pin in that and come back to it. But for now, I know that election officials do oppose this bill and there's already a lawsuit against it. What's the likelihood of that lawsuit having success and actually impacting these restrictions?
So there's actually now 2 federal lawsuits challenging the Florida law. That was a new development this afternoon. They were filed by the League of Women Voters, the NAACP, and advocates for retired people and for Floridians with disabilities. They're hoping a judge will agree with them and say that the law is unconstitutional and disproportionately affects people of color and voters with disabilities. But if they're not successful, election supervisors are just going to have to make these new restrictions work within very limited budgets.
And so some activists are saying that at least the Florida restrictions don't seem to be as dire as the restrictions in a state like Georgia. Can you explain what the biggest difference is between the restrictions that we're seeing in both of these southern states?
And so Florida lawmakers were saying this too as they were working on the bill. They made a point of saying this bill isn't Georgia 2.0, meaning that it's not as restrictive when it comes to giving food or water to voters standing in line. That's really important in hot southern states. But the thing is that the bills are still similar in that Florida and Georgia Republicans both wanted to be even more restrictive than they ended up being. They had to walk back those proposals because of the opposition they were getting from the election supervisors. And those initial proposals were things like getting rid of the drop boxes entirely or ending no excuse absentee voting.
And I want to dig into kind of how we learned about this bill getting signed into law. Governor Ron DeSantis gave Fox News an exclusive when he did that this morning. That's very unusual because typically you allow lawmakers and other media outlets in on these things. What do you think his strategy was behind conducting this in this way?
Well, Governor DeSantis said it himself today. His Fox News appearance had a national audience. He's already being talked about as a potential presidential candidate or a running mate in 2024. And in the meantime, he's running for re-election in Florida next year. So today's event looked a lot more like a campaign rally than a typical bill signing ceremony. And the way he's talking about this bill makes it clear that he wants people in other states who believe that they've seen voter fraud in those states to see what he's doing in Florida and that he has a zero tolerance policy for it.
So, Jennifer, I want to end where we started, which is this move by DeSantis going to end up shooting him in the foot a little bit? Because we know that last year more Democrats voted by mail, but in the history of Florida, it's typically more Republicans voting by mail. So what do you think this restriction is going to do for him in a potential 2024 run?
I think it's going to be motivating either way. If you're a voter who believes in the lies about widespread voter fraud in the last election, then what DeSantis is saying might look good to you, and maybe you'll think that jumping through the extra hoops is worth it. but it could also really motivate the grassroots organizers and the people doing voter registration drives that we saw play a really big role in the 2020 election. You have to assume that they'll be using what's happening in Florida and Georgia and Texas to push voters next year.
Jennifer, really appreciate you joining us to break down what's going down in Florida. Thank you. Scarlett?
All right, let's take a look at stories making headlines from around the world. We're going to start in Colombia, which is recovering from a night of violence, which left 46 people injured, dozens of police stations destroyed. Local media report 24 people died in ongoing protests that began when thousands of Colombians took to the streets to oppose a controversial tax reform that has since been withdrawn. Demonstrations continue with calls for further reforms. Over to Germany now, where Catholic priests across the country are defying Pope Francis. They are preparing to bless gay couples despite a recent Vatican ban on the practice. Priests and lay ministers are planning coordinated ceremonies to approve gay relationships in about 100 Catholic churches in coming days. This move is the latest example of how far German Catholics are willing to push the boundaries of the Vatican's authority. And French fishermen starting to leave the British Isle of Jersey, ending their protests over post-Brexit fishing rights. This after the UK and France deployed military patrol ships to the area. Representatives of the fishing fleet who are upset at the conditions attached to licenses needed to operate in the area said they had made their point and will now be returning to France. Negotiations over fishing rights were among the most contentious parts of the post-Brexit deal. For the latest news from your part of the world, go to Bloomberg.com, click on the edition drop-down right next to the Bloomberg masthead, and choose your region. Maddie?
And coming up after the break, economic recovery from the pandemic is leaving communities of color behind. We speak with one leader who's trying to change that when we get back in 2.
Our generation's biggest problem.
Climate change is happening.
And the world's most innovative solutions.
Transport, industry, buildings, electricity, all of those things.
Everything you need to know about our changing environment, the politics of global warming.
We can and we will deal with climate change.
In the fight against climate change, Bloomberg Green has you covered.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Black Americans have never had an equal ability to reap the benefits of business ownership. And when it comes to Black businesses building a supportive ecosystem, it's even harder. A report by McKinsey shows only 4% of Black American businesses survive the startup stage. It found that COVID contributed to forcing 41% of Black-owned businesses in the U.S. to shutting their doors. And while about 15% of white Americans hold some business equity, only 5% of Black Americans do. Jeff Nelson is co-founder and CTO of the media company Blavity, which has now set up a new racial equity organization focused on helping minority-owned businesses. Jeff, great to speak with you. Before we talk about the nonprofit arm of your company, I want to hear about the origins of Blavity. These efforts, I would sense, are personal for you because I'm sure you experienced your own ups and downs when you started the media company.
Absolutely. Well, Madison, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about what we're up to. myself and the other Blavity co-founders, Aaron Samuels and Morgan DeBaun, we all met in college. We went to Washington University in St. Louis, and we were all recipients of a scholarship. And that scholarship gave us three things that were instrumental in helping us be successful at college and beyond. It gave us capital, community, and connections. And we all sort of implicitly knew that, but it was a conversation that we had in our early years of building Blavity as we were just remarking about how hard it was for us to raise venture capital, being a company that was led by Black people and who had a CEO that was a woman, and just how hard and difficult it was to get into some corporate doors to get sponsorships for our events or advertisers on our media brands. And we sort of remarked that we were very fortunate to have a community and connections and capital that supported us early on and throughout our journey through entrepreneurship. So we set a goal to eventually start a social impact component to the business to do the same for other founders who look like us. And that's what we've done today with Blavity.org.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit more about Blavity.org, how it works and what your mission is.
So Blavity.org is a nonprofit that is founded by the three of us, me, Morgan, Aaron. And what we're doing today is we're announcing our Growth Fellowship. We selected 12 fellows from across a variety of industries. And what we're doing is we're giving them $10,000 in non-dilutive capital to help them grow and scale their business. We're going to put them in a 6-month program that is going to give them tools, resourcing, and coaching to also grow and accelerate as well. We hope to roll out some additional programs in the coming months and years, but right now we're focused on this Growth Fellowship because we think that the most tangible thing we can do to begin to attack some of those disparities that you mentioned in the intro is to really put money into Black founders and do it in a way that doesn't take away from their ownership potential in their companies.
I'm so glad you bring that up, Jeff, because one thing that I find interesting when we have these conversations is that we're talking about what Black entrepreneurs and business owners can do themselves, but it's a system that is really challenging to work within. I think about VC firms where, you know, they're led by a lot of white men who are looking to give that money and support to people who look like them. So what do you think is the biggest thing that could be done to break down that system?
So it's multifaceted. And you mentioned VCs. And one of the reasons I emphasize the fact that the funding we're giving to the fellows in our cohort being non-dilutive is because very few Black founders are, relatively speaking, are able to raise VC dollars. But when they do, oftentimes they get bad deal terms, right? Because when you're a Black founder and your options are so few, you really don't have a lot of leverage in negotiation, right? So Black founders disproportionately get bad deal terms when they do manage to raise VC dollars. And so that's something that we want to address as well, right? So how can we put non-dilutive capital into these businesses? But more importantly, when we're working with brands and corporations, how can we get them to understand that you've got to patronize these Black businesses? If you are looking for vendors, if you're looking for artists or creatives, or if you're looking to partner with individuals, you should look to these Black entrepreneurs and these Black businesses, actually put revenue into those companies because that's going to help them to improve their balance sheets and grow and scale.
I'm glad you bring that up too, Jeff, because earlier we were talking about voting rights restrictions in Florida. We're seeing that in Georgia too, and corporations are starting to speak out against those things. Do you wish that these corporations would go a step further and maybe put their money where their mouth is and, like you said, invest in these Black-owned businesses?
Absolutely. And I live in Atlanta. So Georgia has been sort of a hotbed of political activity over the last several months. And it's great to live here because there's so much activity and so much needed discussion. I do think corporations have to put their money where their mouth is, where they spend their dollars, show what they care about. You know, the CEO can make a statement. The marketing team can do all sorts of campaigns. But if the dollars don't follow, then it rings hollow. Just to give you a tangible example, Blavity's a media company. We have partnerships with a number of brands to run ads on our media sites and sponsor our events. That's a great opportunity for brands to work with us and say, hey, we want to show a Black millennial audience that we care and we're sincere. And we welcome those opportunities to work with brands and corporations.
Jeff Nelson, co-founder of Blavity, really appreciate you joining us to talk about this new venture. Thank you. Scarlett?
Let's get you to today's movers and shakers, the people impacting the worlds of business, politics, and sports. Hollywood power couple John Krasinski and Emily Blunt are in a pay dispute with Paramount Pictures over the studio's streaming plans for A Quiet Place Part 2. Their contract, which is based on the film's box office performance, had its theater run cut in half from 90 days to 45. Now, the move comes as Paramount speeds up the online release of Paramount Plus, which would, of course, reduce box office receipts and pay for the actors. Depending on how the dispute plays out, it could impact future contracts and pay throughout the industry. Details of one of the wealthiest divorces shows Melinda French Gates receiving over $2 billion of stock the past few days. The transfer comes from Cascade Investment, which is Bill Gates' holding company. The most recent shift was for two of Mexico's biggest companies, Coca-Cola FEMSA and Grupo Televisa, tallying more than $500 million. David Swensen, the chief investment officer of Yale's endowment, has passed away at the age of 67. Swensen pioneered how college endowments are managed, shifting away from traditional funds with stocks and bonds to favoring hard-to-sell assets like private equity. This model paid off big time for Yale, generating annualized returns of almost 11% from 2010 through 2020. His impact lives on with some of the wealthiest investors looking to replicate his investment model. And Kane Tanaka, the world's oldest person at 118 years old, has pulled out from the Tokyo 2020 Olympic torch relay. And the reason? COVID concerns. The relay started in March and it's been pretty rocky. 6 people helping with the tradition have been diagnosed with COVID-19, raising the case number for the event up to 8. And those are your movers and shakers. Coming up after the break, football tackles climate change. The LA Rams tells us how the team is helping the environment and cutting down on its carbon emissions. This is quick.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Our generation's biggest problem.
Climate change is happening.
And the world's most innovative solutions.
Transport, industry, buildings, electricity, all of those things.
Everything you need to know about our changing environment, the politics of global warming.
We can and we will deal with climate change.
In the fight against climate change, Bloomberg Green has you covered.
It is never too early to talk football. Every NFL team will typically play 8 to 9 away games a season, traveling by bus or chartering flights, which can leave a pretty big carbon footprint. The Los Angeles Rams are looking to minimize their carbon footprint by partnering with Castrol on a new environmental sustainability program. Quick Take's Vanessa Perdomo spoke with the Rams' Chief Operating Officer, Kevin Demoff, about how the team plans to do just this.
So, Kevin, can you tell me about this new partnership between the Rams and Castrol?
Very exciting partnership, and I think one of the things when we built SoFi Stadium in Hollywood Park last year, we really wanted to focus on sustainability in terms of the design, reclaimable water, the entire project in 300 acres. And Castrol, partnering with them, what allows us to do is not only focus on sustainability at home in Los Angeles and Inglewood and Hollywood Park, but really as we travel throughout this year with 5 long road trips away from Los Angeles, really offsetting our carbon footprint and partnering with Keep America Beautiful to really make sure we go into every market we play in and leave it better than we found it. So exciting work at home and throughout the country in keeping America beautiful.
That's great. And about your initiative to reduce your carbon footprint when traveling, how exactly are you planning on doing that?
So we're going to work with Castrol using their carbon calculator on their website to calculate, the carbon offsets we have from when we travel as a team and fly to away cities, our buses, and then work with Castrol to basically offset those and pay for those. And then along with that, when we travel, we're going to pick up 1 ton of waste in each visiting city that we go to and partner with the local community and keep America beautiful to do that. So really what you're looking at is it's twofold: reducing carbon emission and cleaning up the streets of the cities that we go and visit, as well as being very cognizant of doing that here at home in Los Angeles.
And speaking of being at home in Los Angeles, this past few years, California has experienced some devastating wildfires due to the effects of climate change. Has that affected your reasoning to do this partnership and to get more involved in the environment at all?
Well, certainly, as someone who grew up in California and a native, I remember, we would have fires and floods. That's been part of California, but never to the extreme that we've seen. And, we felt the effects a few years ago. Our entire practice facility and office was shut down during the Woolsey fire. We were evacuated for 2.5 weeks. Dozens of our staff lost homes, hundreds evacuated. And you see it every year. The fires get more devastating here, the climate change. So certainly anything we can do as an organization to help, California improve, its microclimates, its atmosphere, make sure that people here are safe and healthy. And Castrol's been an amazing partner in looking and tackling that specifically here in Los Angeles. But obviously, it's something we want to look at across the country as well.
Absolutely. And so a lot of people would say, what does a football team have to do with the environment? Can you tell me why the environment and sustainability is so important to the Rams organization?
Look, I think it starts with leadership in the community. And our job is not just to play football 17 times a year on Sundays, but really to have community leadership, the other 348 days a year. And where that comes down to is finding the causes that are important to our players. We've got a young, group. If you look at our players, their average age is 25, 26. They're going to be on this planet a long time. This is one thing, that they do take meaningfully and serious, is making sure that, the climate, the weather, the planet's in a better place for them in 30 and 40 years and for their kids and their future generations. It's something that's personal to all of us. And I think when we went and built one of the world's largest stadiums at SoFi Stadium, you had to take a sustainability lens, and a climate lens through it. Otherwise, you're not doing your part as a good corporate citizen. When you build a 3.1 million square foot stadium that is going to be, one of the amazing wonders of the world, one of the first questions people are going to think about is resources needed to keep that building going. And you want to make sure that sustainability is at the core of the design, the core of the project, and something you can be proud of when you talk about SoFi Stadium.
Absolutely. And SoFi Stadium is praised for its innovation and sustainability efforts. So can you tell me a little bit more about what specifically, when building that stadium, what the sustainability efforts were, how important they were, and what is the carbon footprint of SoFi Stadium compared to maybe other older stadiums?
Well, I think one of the first things you look at when SoFi Stadium is the design, right? A stadium with no walls and a covered roof, so it reduces the impact of heat inside, but also as a result, we don't need air conditioning or an HVAC system to blow through the entire stadium, which significantly reduces the carbon footprint and the climate footprint and the energy footprint of SoFi Stadium. Then you look at over 11 million tons of recycled water a year throughout the 300 acres. SoFi Stadium is not just a football stadium. It's a 300-acre development with housing, office space, retail and entertainment, movie theaters. And so it's making sure that there are 25 acres of parks and lakes there, a ton of greenery, to eat up that carbon footprint, and also to make sure that it is sustainable when you have reclaimed water throughout the project cycling through. Nothing leaves the site, it all gets reclaimed. So it's a really amazing footprint in a very urban area to help try to beautify the space around it in a dense urban footprint.
That was Quick Takes Vanessa Perdomo speaking with the LA Rams COO. Maddie?
Coming up after the break, all vaccine rollouts are not created equal across the world. We'll find out what's being done to help the most vulnerable populations on the planet, and we're going to be back in 2 minutes.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Vaccines are just one tool to help suppress the spread of COVID, but health officials say vaccine hesitancy could set back the pandemic's end date. In some parts of the world, people are passing on the shots, and others with more vulnerable populations, they just don't have them. To put this all into context, we are happy to welcome UN Undersecretary General for Global Communications, Melissa Fleming. Melissa, thank you for being here. We have a lot we want to get to, and I know my co-host Scarlett has a ton of smart questions for you as well. But first, paint a global picture for me of vaccine hesitancy. What's the main thing that's stopping people from getting this shot?
Well, I mean, it's combined with supply, of course. I think right now our biggest problem is lack of supply. Our biggest problem is that the world's rich countries are vaccinating their populations like crazy. And the richest countries in the world have vaccinated 80% or have 80% of the vaccines. And we're seeing in the poorest countries that, you know, some have don't even have hope for a vaccine in this year or even next year. So there's a lot of inequality in supply, and this is a problem. We're hoping that this can be resolved soon. But coupled with that, we're seeing in some places enormous hesitancy in some communities. And in others, it's really just that holdout, like here in the United States, where we're worried that this percentage of people will prevent the U.S. from ever reaching the so-called herd immunity. The vaccine supply is not the issue. It's just the uptake that's going to be the problem.
So it sounds like globally, the bigger emergency right now is vaccine availability versus vaccine hesitancy. I want to ask about Verified, which is an initiative that the UN rolled out last spring to deal and push back against misinformation. What are you doing differently with Verified now, 1 year into the pandemic, than before? Because priorities are different depending on what region you're looking at, as we just mentioned, and there's obviously a different level of urgency in the rich world versus the developed world or developing world.
Absolutely. You summarized that perfectly. It's really shifted, but you know, we started out with Verified to kind of flood the internet with science-based information, public health guidance that people could use, and to try to fill those gaps where disinformation and misinformation actors were trying to dominate. This hasn't changed at all. The need for good public health guidance 1 year on into this pandemic is still there in a number of countries. So we're continuing to put out those, just very basic pieces of information on what to do to protect yourself from the virus, how to protect your community. It's really, nothing has changed there. It's masks, walking hands, social distancing. But at the same time, we are communicating very strongly about vaccines. We do need to communicate to build confidence in the vaccine. And it is a miracle that we have this safe and effective vaccine, and several of them in such a record time. The real fundamental problem, as we said before, is supply and making sure the entire world gets vaccinated, or we're never going to end this pandemic.
So I hear you saying supply is the issue, but we also, like you said, here in the U.S., the hesitancy is a real problem that we're seeing continue. And one way to entice people to get the shot is to remind them that life will be more normal after they get it. But in the U.S., again, people feel like their lives are already kind of normal if they haven't been following the CDC guidelines. So what do you wish people who are saying, I'm going to skip the shot because my life is already good to go, what do you wish they understood about how getting the shot affects more vulnerable populations around the world that don't have access to the shots yet?
Well, that's right. I mean, it does mean that here in the U.S. and certainly because we're not going to stay an island forever, everywhere else in the world, that we will not end the pandemic if there are not enough people who will take the vaccine. What does that mean? I mean, there are people who believe that they're immune from it or that it's not going to be so devastating for them. Yeah. But I think it's important to communicate how devastating it is potentially for others, and that you can be a carrier if you're not vaccinated of the virus. You could be hurting other people. You could be giving it to other people. And as a consequence, other people could die. But there's no cookie cutter way to speak to the vaccine hesitant. People have legitimate fears, legitimate concerns. So we're really trying to mobilize trusted messengers. This is the best way to convince people, members of the community, doctors, pharmacists, local celebrities to really deliver that message.
So at the same time, you're talking about vaccine availability, and U.S. and others have been slow to share their vaccine patents, and that's now starting to change, of course. But even so, developing countries getting access to that IP still will struggle to get the supplies and the manufacturing needed to develop those vaccines and get them out. So what do you think is the single biggest thing that developing nations need right now to be able to get access to more vaccines?
Right. Well, it's a combination, and this really was a breakthrough to have the U.S. Agree to, to allow a sharing of information about the vaccines with potential manufacturers in other countries and poorer countries. So that could be a game changer in supply around the world. So we're really welcoming that. At the same time, we have this international facility, WHO, Gavi, that's called COVAX, and it is functioning in well over 100 countries. It is there on the ground working with the UN system, UNICEF, WHO, ready to deliver vaccines. This health system shored up. Everybody, the readiness is there. Again, it's a question of supply. So if more countries could share excess doses, if we could get more donations to COVAX so that more vaccines could be purchased, we could go a long way towards shifting this inequality of vaccine supply around the world, and also ending the pandemic in the near future.
Melissa, this is a great conversation. In our final minute here, I know you spent 10 years at the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, so you got to keep a close eye on the world's 69 million refugees and displaced people. Give us an update on the trajectory of COVID cases in places like Syria and other areas of conflict. Very quickly here.
Well, yeah, this is of course extremely worrying. These are areas where people are already in desperate situations, poor hygiene. Very struggling just to feed themselves and to shelter themselves. So it's extremely difficult to reach them with the measures that are needed and also the healthcare that's needed. Just one thing to say, though, it's some good news, perhaps. I think over 130 countries have agreed to also include refugees in their vaccination